Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I know several of you have come from different parts of this country. The very fact that you are all here today demonstrates your extraordinary commitment to your professional development. So I'm happy to be a little part of that. And I wish to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I also wish to commend them for putting together an excellent program for you. There are several presentations which are aimed at giving you very specific ideas, techniques, and strategies. Therefore, as a keynote speaker, my intention is to present to you the big picture as I see it. And I want to begin with the process of globalization and how it has created opportunities for all nations, including China, and how China has been responding to the opportunities, particularly in the field of English language education. Now, we all know that we live in a globalized and a globalizing world. Globalization has become a driving force, a dominant force that is shaping and reshaping nations, economies, cultures, and people's lives everywhere. People's lives are more intensely and more instantly linked than ever before in the history of humankind. We are all, in a way, a very little microscopic mesh in a global web. And what is actually accelerating the process of globalization, functioning as its central engine, is information technology. The internet, the social media, mobile technology, all of these are making globalization a very serious consequences for humanity everywhere. And I see three important aspects of globalization: economic globalization, educational globalization, and cultural globalization. Now, economic globalization is clearly marked by manifold increase in the international flow of capital, goods, and labor force from different parts of the world. In the involvement of global financial systems, not only in the lives of corporations, but in the lives of nations and individuals everywhere, and in the role of transnational corporations, and in opening up foreign direct investments in a number of countries. And it's also opening up outsourcing opportunities for several countries. The economies of countries are so linked with each other that any recession or a financial mismanagement in one country can easily impact on many other countries. Just to recall the economic fallout from Greece and how it affected the economies of the entire European Union. Now, when it comes to cultural globalization, what we see is a completely free flow of cultural ideas and traveling freely across the world. Now, foreign cultures are no longer foreign, and local communities are no longer cultural islands, because in one way or another, Sitting in our drawing room, we come to know the cultural lives of people everywhere, the good, the bad, and yes, the ugly. Because of this, several nations see a threat, either real or perceived, to their local identities, and they try to preserve, protect, and promote their local identities. But at the same time, people and nations everywhere try to learn from each other and try to expand their cultural horizon, while at the same time, without losing their own basic cultural values. And this last point, learning from others while at the same time not losing our own identities, is a very important factor when it comes to English language education. I will go back to that in a minute. Now, after impacting on the economies and cultures of the world, globalization has turned its attention to education. And educational globalization is marked by opening up of education sector in many countries. Study abroad programs and collaborative research between universities in different countries are actually picking up. And a number of Western countries, particularly Ivy League universities in the United States, are competing with each other to open overseas campuses in order to influence higher education in different parts of the world. In fact, there are a number of financial consulting firms which are involved in studying and making recommendations about global capital investment in local education. And McKinsey & Company is one of those international companies which has been playing a crucial role helping policymakers in Chinese educational system. Now, if you turn to China, how China has been responding to economic, cultural, and educational globalization, and how it is responding itself, is a lesson for the rest of the world. China is now playing a very central role in economic globalization. And it has become the world's largest exporter and the largest manufacturer. And it is now the second largest economy in the world. And according to a world report, it will become the largest economy in just the next few years. Currently, about 20,000 Chinese enterprises are operating in more than 175 countries. And Chinese overseas investment is expected to reach 150 billion US dollars in just next 3 years. And moreover, the global use of Chinese currency yuan is actually increasing everywhere. Now, the Chinese current path in terms of culture is also quite noteworthy. The Chinese government has been trying to use what's called the soft power to promote Chinese language and Chinese culture all over the world. And the goal has been stated as to enhance friendship and mutual understanding between China and other nations, and to elevate China's influence in the international community. To accomplish that goal, the Chinese government has started, as you know, Confucius Institutes in different parts of the world. And in the year 2005, there were only 10. It became 350 in 2011, and it's expected to increase to 500 in 2015. So these Confucius Institutes and the way they have spread all over the world demonstrate China's commitment to expand its cultural presence and to the world's desire to learn more about Chinese language and Chinese culture. And all this will have a serious impact on the policies and practices of English language education in this country. So when it comes to education, Chinese educational reform is marked by 5 important key elements. Number 1, adopting learner-centered teaching aimed at each student's personal development. 2, shifting the authority for curriculum and instruction from the national level to the local level as far as possible. And 3, addressing the demands of globalization and the consequent need for fostering international understanding. Caring for the natural world and the environment. And finally, focusing on how subject matter knowledge, whether they are from the field of science or humanities or social sciences, and how they can be closely related to the personal lives of individual students. So all these global goals that have been set by the Ministry of Education are a clear indication how China is trying to be in tune with the demands of globalization. And because of the increasing processes of globalization, what is being talked about abroad is the importance of developing global citizenship in our students. Educators everywhere, not just in China, are faced with unprecedented challenges as well as unlimited opportunities to help their students become global citizens and develop in the learner the knowledge, the abilities, and the attitudes necessary to be a part of the global society. And just a few years ago, in fact, just last year, the National Education Association of the United States released a very important report on higher education and also secondary education. And the report is titled, Preparing 21st Century Students for a Global Society. And the report makes certain very crucial points. Number 1, it says we need to go way beyond the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And these skills are not at all adequate to cope with the challenges of the emerging global society. So instead of these 3 R's, the report is talking about 4 C's now. Critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. These are the skills that are crucially needed for success in a global society. And what these actually means is that as educators, we may have to pay attention to linguistic competencies and cultural competencies that we want to develop in our learners. Now, what exactly are the linguistic competencies we are talking about? First, language as a system. The phonological, semantic, and syntactic system that deals with the rules of grammar. We all know that this is what we have been focusing on. But that's not sufficient. We need to focus on language as a discourse as well, which relates to the much talked about communicative competence. But most important of all, we need to help our learners look at language as ideology. How language is used, abused, and misused for purposes that serve the dominant members of a society. And this is the most important skill that is required to be a successful global citizen. And as language educators, we have a crucial role to play in developing this kind of linguistic competency in our students. And in terms of cultural competencies, globalization really demands much, much broader cross-cultural awareness in all of us educators and also in our students. Now, until recently, and even today in a number of institutions all over the world, when it comes to teaching a foreign or a second language, the primary focus has been to tell our students, help them understand the cultural beliefs and practices of the target language community. But in my view, that's a very narrow, very limited and limiting perspective in our developing global society. Learners actually need to develop what I have called global cultural consciousness. Knowing something about the cultures of the target language community is no longer sufficient. And in order for helping our students to become or to develop global consciousness, and in order for them to be successful in their attempt, what do they have to do? They have to, number one, go beyond all those stereotypes that we find in our textbooks. Stereotypes about festivals and food, about other cultural communities, stereotypes about myths and manners, and we need to go way beyond these superficial cultural knowledge. Second, they have to understand the underlying cultural connections and try to find out why people behave the way they do. And they also must recognize the multiplicity of cultural realities, which means that they must recognize that there is no one single culture in the world which embodies everything that is virtuous. And there is no one single culture in the world which represents all that is evil. Every culture is a combination of both. And we need to help our students understand that reality. And most importantly, we have to help our learners to learn from other cultures, not just about other cultures. These then are the challenges imposed upon us by cultural globalization. As language educators, we just cannot escape from these responsibilities. What exactly is the language connection between the cultural competencies I talked about and the language that we teach? Well, language learners are better placed to develop better critical thinking abilities, more effective communication skills, and deeper international understanding. And English in this case, English teachers particularly, have a special responsibility for one simple reason, and that is English, in its role as a global language, creates, reflects, and spreads the import and imagery of the global flows. So by learning English, you are actually getting introduced to these international cultural flows. And English is now looked upon more as a global communicational tool than as a colonial cultural carrier. So we need to get away from our past thinking that English comes with imperialistic or colonial tendencies. It all depends on what you do with the English language. So we need to necessarily help our learners use the global language to gain economic capital, cultural capital, and linguistic capital. These are the new responsibilities imposed upon English language educators everywhere. Specifically turning to China, how is China responding to the challenges facing English language teaching? Now, in its recent history, the year 2001 is a watershed year for China. Because in 2001, China became a member of WTO. And in 2001, China released the outline of basic education curriculum reform. And in 2001, China proposed new English curriculum for schools. Why did all these things happen in 2001? It's not at all a coincidence. As soon as China entered the WTO, the government and policymakers recognized the role China has to play. And in order to be successful, more than anything else, they have to develop proper educational quality in their country that includes general education as well as English language education. And this was followed within about 3 years by the release of college English curriculum requirements. If you have read these documents, you will find something in common. All these documents recognize English is an indispensable language needed to establish global citizenship and to establish China's global power. And that's one reason I have been saying that as English language educators, you have a special responsibility, not only towards your learners, but towards the development of your country. So if you look at what exactly were promised by these documents, here is one important quotation. Curricular goals to develop students' comprehensive language competence by making learning a process during which students develop language proficiency, form positive attitudes, improve thinking skills, increase cross-cultural awareness, and learn to use learning strategies so as to gradually become independent learners. Please note that something that is remarkable in this document is how Chinese policymakers have been able to anticipate the report released in 2012 by US National Education Association. So what exactly were produced or were suggested as pathways to reach that goal? Number one, the educators have been asked to shift transmission-centered teaching to inquiry-centered teaching, and that's a quote from the document outline. And second, make English compulsory from grade 3. And as you know, there are metropolitan cities like Beijing and Shanghai where schools have started introducing English even from grade 1. And third, accelerate the use of communicative language teaching. And that was actually specifically recommended by one of those reports. So as you know, CLT, communicative language teaching, was originally introduced in China in 1990s, early 1990s. Which means it's nearly 2 decades since CLT has been introduced in schools. And it is a very legitimate question in my view to ask, what difference have the promises and pathways have made to the learning and teaching of English in China? That, I believe, is a legitimate reflective question that all of us should be thinking about. Now, what exactly are the answers? There can be as many answers as there are participants in this conference. But when I look at recent research publications from China, I'm able to collect a few results from the projects conducted here in China. And these research projects present a very complex picture about what has been happening in Chinese schools and colleges, particularly during the last 20 years after CLT was introduced. Number one, teaching is still transmission-centered and has not become inquiry-oriented at all. Second, the chosen method, CLT, is used only in a few better equipped schools in large cities. And in most other schools in big cities, a mix of grammar translation, audiolingual, and communicative language teaching is used. But in semi-urban and rural areas, even today, it's mostly grammar translation and audiolingual is used. And these practices raise important questions for language educators. What next? And that's a crucial question. And we know, and you know, that all these things have produced very poor communicative competence in our learners and very poor cultural competence in the learners. Okay. Now, if I ask you the question, why do we think that happened? Why do we think nearly 20 years of very sincere, concerted effort to develop linguistic and communicative competence in Chinese learners, why do you think that has not succeeded to the extent that we expected? There can be any number of reasons. I'm sure you can think of a number of them. Right now, standing on my feet, I can think of at least a half a dozen reasons. But I want to choose one particular factor and talk about it today. And it seems to me, and I may be wrong, because you know better, it seems to me that Chinese language education has not succeeded to the extent it expected, partly because of what I call probably a misplaced priority. And what I mean by that is the priority has been quite excessively on method of teaching, particularly communicative language teaching. And we all know that any imported method has to be contextually adapted to make it workable in a particular situation. Now, that's not easy at all. To take a method from another place and try to modify it to suit it to our context, to our linguistic, educational, and cultural context. That's not easy at all. And at this point, I want to talk about a particular phrase in the theme of the conference, which is, look at the last 4 words there, new perspectives on English education in the Chinese context. Focus on the phrase in the Chinese context. And I have used that in my abstract as well. What is the Chinese context? The Chinese context is not monolithic. The conditions that are there, that exist in metropolitan cities like Beijing and Shanghai for learning and teaching, those conditions do not exist everywhere. The conditions for successful language learning differ from metropolitan cities to urban areas, from urban areas to rural areas. Therefore, to some extent, the phrase in the Chinese context has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, I said it's very difficult to modify and adapt a particular method to suit your conditions. But even, let's say this for the sake of argument. Even if you succeed in modifying a particular method to suit your conditions, let's keep one thing in mind. Method is only one variable, one factor that contributes to success in language learning and language teaching. There are many other factors, including environmental factors, historical, social, cultural, political, institutional, and more. And there are learner factors, their needs, their motivation, their autonomy, learning styles, and learning strategies. And there are also teachers. Most importantly, teacher knowledge, teacher cognition, teacher beliefs, teacher values, and teacher identities. All these factors, and even more, play a crucial role in the success or failure of language learning and language teaching. Therefore, to focus all our attention or most of our attention excessively on one particular factor called a method is a clear recipe for failure. And that is my assessment based on my reading of Chinese literature. So therefore, what I think is necessary is to change priorities. Okay? I believe what is badly wanted is a fundamental rethinking of English language education in China. And what is needed is a sustained, targeted, and reformed focus, primarily on teaching methods, teaching education, teacher knowledge, and teacher inquiry. So I'm actually calling for all of you language educators in this country to pay a little more attention to these factors and attempt to shift your priorities from an exclusive attention to method to a number of other factors which I believe are crucial. Let me address each one of these briefly. Okay. Let's be very clear about what methods are and what they are not. And as I have stated previously in my work, the term method actually refers to certain set of ideas conceptualized and constructed by experts in the field. Normally, a method consists of very specific set of classroom techniques derived from a very specific set of theoretical principles from linguistic psychology, etc. And that is different from methodology, which refers to what practicing teachers actually do in the classroom to achieve their learning and teaching objectives. These two, method and methodology, are not the same. Okay? And number two, let's also be very clear that a mere adoption of a communicative syllabus or a communicative textbook does not guarantee at all a communicative classroom. It does not guarantee learners' development of communicative competence. You may have the best syllabus in the world, you may have the best textbook in the world, but what ultimately matters is what the teacher does in the classroom with that syllabus, with the textbook, and with the learners. In fact, a teacher can very well use a structural syllabus and render the classroom highly communicative. Conversely, a teacher can use a communicative syllabus and render the class completely structural. Now, this is a kind of a common knowledge in the field, and I'm not saying this originally. In fact, a highly reputed scholar who was a speaker in this conference just last time, 2 years ago, said pretty much the same thing. And I'm referring to Henry Widdowson. Let's read what he has to say. Teachers can teach in reference to your notional functional syllabus That's his reference to a communicative syllabus. In just the same way as they previously taught in reference to a structural syllabus. Conversely, it's perfectly possible to adopt a communicative methodology in the realization of a syllabus designed along structural lines. So, I do not see that there is anything paradoxical or perverse in saying that there is no such thing as a communicative syllabus. Pay attention to the last part of the sentence. There is no such thing as a communicative syllabus, and to that we might add, there is no such thing as a communicative textbook. Syllabuses don't communicate. Textbooks don't communicate. Teachers communicate. Learners communicate. That should be our focus. And I'm saying this because of a very simple logic. And that is, we cannot prepare our teachers to tackle so many unpredictable needs, wants, and situations. We can only help them develop a capacity to generate varied and situation-specific ideas within a general framework that makes sense in terms of current pedagogical and theoretical knowledge. This is very simple and logical. And therefore, all our attempts in teaching must be geared towards addressing that particular logic. That's very simple. And importantly, such a recognition demands a crucial, central, and reformed role for language teacher education. Now, it is very easy to say that most of our teachers are not inquiry-oriented. And that's true. But I don't blame the teachers for that. I blame the teacher education that they have gone through. And I'll talk about it a little bit more a little later. Now, in terms of teacher education, and I see global attention has been turned towards it in a number of countries. Just a few years ago, 10 different countries in the world, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and China, 10 different countries joined together and formed an alliance, and they called it the International Alliance of Leading Educational Institutes. And this alliance published its very first report in 2008. And what is the title of this report? Transforming Teacher Education. So this International Alliance of Educational Institutions turned to teacher education as the most important responsibility. And what do they have to say about teacher education in a global society? Notwithstanding their origins, commonalities, and differences, all systems of teacher preparation have to rethink their core assumptions and processes in the new global context. That's just another way of saying all the existing models of teacher education are not sufficient to produce inquiry-oriented teachers or transformative-based learners. If we want to succeed in that attempt, we have to look at teacher education model itself. And this alliance calls for what they have called transformative teacher education. And this is crucial because what we have now is mostly called a transmission model of teacher education. But any transformative teacher education must be designed to help teachers focus more on the active production of personal knowledge than on the passive application of received wisdom. In simpler terms, it only means that we have to develop the knowledge and the skill and the attitude necessary for our teachers to become transformative teachers so that they can learn from their own classroom and make suitable adjustments in their teaching processes. And second, any transformative teacher education must focus more on mastering the teaching model than on modeling the master teacher. Let me explain that a little bit. I know there are several of you who are very much interested in observing somebody else teach, in observing demonstration classes by master teachers. I'm not dismissing the importance of observation of good teachers. Certainly you can learn something from that. But you can only very little from that observation. You cannot become a master teacher. You cannot become a highly performing teacher by merely observing somebody else teach. It is something like saying that if you keep on watching week after week the excellent performing art of the wife of President C and her folk songs, if you keep on watching her perform every year, week after week, you just cannot become as skillful and as wonderful as the First Lady. Merely watching and observing has its limitations. And what is needed is much more than that. Secondly, oh, by the way, if any of you are interested to know more about transformative teacher education, please look at my latest book called Language Teacher Education for a Global Society, in which I talk about how to design transformative teacher education. Let's be clear about one thing. A transmission model of teacher education cannot be expected to produce transformative teachers. Or, to put it slightly differently, you cannot plant a cactus and expect roses to bloom. That's impossible. So we need to focus on teacher education. So we need to shift our attention from transmission to transformation. Because transmission models are information oriented, not inquiry oriented. And they cannot produce inquiry oriented teachers. And student teachers fail to develop a holistic understanding of learning and teaching. And because of that, they lack necessary knowledge base to see the pattern that connects all the factors of education. Teacher education must help teachers develop professional knowledge, personal knowledge, and procedural knowledge and personal knowledge. And let me briefly talk about each one of them. Now, by professional knowledge, I'm talking about what you normally get in your teacher education programs. Facts, theories, concepts, mostly expert produced. And you learn about languages, system, languages, discourse and ideology, etc. You learn about language learning, and you learn about language teaching, methods, materials, curriculum, and all that. So that constitutes professional knowledge. And the main source of this professional knowledge, of course, your teacher education program. You can get them from scholarly books, journals, and of course, attending conferences like this. And procedural knowledge is just management skills. Strategies for planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating classroom events and activities. It includes topic management and talk management. How do you manage classroom talk and the topics that come up for discussion? And how do you organize individual work, pair work, and group work? And most importantly, how do you deal with unexpected challenges that might crop up in your classroom? So all this constitute what I call procedural knowledge. But more important than professional knowledge And more important than procedural knowledge is teachers' personal knowledge. And this is the most important aspect of teacher knowledge, in my view. Because if professional knowledge is the collective enterprise of the expert, personal knowledge is the individual endeavor of the teacher. And how does a teacher develop this personal knowledge? By observations, experiences, reflections, and interpretations gathered over a long period of time. So this kind of a personal knowledge cannot be gathered overnight. It's a long and hard process. And this comes out of pretty much unexplained and unexplainable understanding of what constitutes good teaching. And through this personal knowledge, teachers develop what Prabhu has called their sense of plausibility. And Van Menon used the phrase sense-making. So for individual teachers to make sense of what happens in their classroom and to develop their own sense of plausibility, they have to develop and sharpen their personal knowledge. Okay. And normally this personal knowledge is shaped and reshaped by sustained and systematic teacher inquiry. You notice that I'm using the phrase teacher inquiry, not teacher research. That's because somehow several teachers have developed a kind of negative feeling towards research. They think it's somebody else sitting in a university to do, not me, the classroom teacher. So that's why I'm using the term teacher inquiry. And what do teachers have to do to conduct teacher inquiry? Teacher inquiry happens when there is action in thought and thought in action. That's Van Menon. He's simply saying, when you are teaching, think about what you are doing. So your action and thought should help each other, should complement each other. So what is required is this critical reflection about what happens in the classroom. And it must focus on the practice of everyday teaching, based on what happens in the classroom, not just about what you read in books and papers. And I'm not suggesting that when I ask you to do teacher inquiry, that you do some grand projects, statistically controlled, variable focused. No, I'm not talking about that. I know practicing teachers do not have much time to do that kind of a sustained research work. All I'm asking you to do is just keep your eyes and ears open in the classroom. Notice what works and what doesn't work, with what group of learners and for what reason. And think about what changes are necessary. If something works, think about why it worked. If something did not work, think about why it did not work. And learning from that personal experience is what constitutes teacher inquiry. And therefore, we are actually talking about classroom-based inquiry, because this inquiry has to be based on what happens in the classroom. Okay. And there are a number of ideas that are out there in the literature. Dick Albright has talked about exploratory research. Burns talks about action research. Edge talks about teacher research. And I have written about what I have called classroom discourse analysis from a critical perspective. Now, why am I asking you to focus on the classroom? More than the professional knowledge that you can get in teacher education programs or from books or from conferences. Because classroom is the most important site where you can learn from. Earl Stavik said it in 1980. Success depends less on materials less on techniques, less on linguistic analysis, but more on what goes on inside and between people in the classroom. And I formulated the same thing in a different way much later, in 2003. Classroom is the site where the effectiveness of innovative thoughts on teaching is tested and tried. What actually happens there largely determines the extent to which learning potential is realized and the desired outcomes are achieved. So without understanding what happens in the classroom, there is no way you can improve your teaching. So what do you have to specifically to do? All you have to do is to pay attention to your own teaching. Monitor your teaching acts. Occasionally, videotape your classes. You don't have to do it every time you teach. Maybe once a month, or once in 3 months, once in 6 months. Videotape your class. And collect, analyze, and interpret classroom data that you collect from the classroom. Focus on teacher input, teacher talk, the content of the lesson, the size, the style of classroom interaction between teachers and learners and learners and learners, the strategies that teachers and learners use to maximize learning opportunities, and potential mismatches between teacher intention and learner interpretation. All these things that you can understand only if you look at your own classroom in a sustained and systematic way. And once you get that idea, revise and refine your classroom teaching based on your analysis, understanding, and interpretation. In doing this kind of classroom-based work, you can actually seek help from your own colleagues in your school or college. Form small groups of interested teachers. So as a team together, you can play the role of collaborators in a joint enterprise. So therefore, the most important thing that I want you to remember from this presentation is learning from your own classroom. You can learn from your classroom much more than you can learn from your 2 years of teacher education program. You can learn more from your classroom than attending any number of conferences. You can learn more from your classroom by reading any number of research papers. Even if you do all those things, if you do not understand what happens in your classroom, you just cannot become a successful teacher. That's plain and simple. And there is no better substitute for achieving professional development other than learning from your classroom. And your immediate goal, as Van Manen said, is making sense of your classroom. Your ultimate goal, of course, is for you to develop your own personal theory of practice. Try to make sense of your practice. Understand what works, what doesn't work. And that eventually will lead you to develop your own theory of your classroom practice. So let me leave you with words of wisdom from an Indian poet who I believe is very well known to educated public in China. And he said, a teacher can never truly teach unless he is still learning himself. That includes herself also. A lamp can never light another lamp unless it continues to burn with its own flame. And the person I'm referring to is Rabindranath Tagore. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about this, the importance of learning from the classroom. And as you think about it, keep that lamp burning forever. Thank you very much.